History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Dark Side Podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Hi everyone, just a quick message to remind everyone to follow all the social media accounts. If you head over to politicaldarkside.com, you'll find links for the Twitter, Instagram and Facebook group. There's also a link to a Gofundme if you're feeling generous. Episode 5 with Ray McGovern has got close to 500 views and listens across all platforms, so a big thank you to everyone for helping me get this far. YouTube seems to be the main outlet for people to enjoy the show, so please remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel and also subscribe through whichever podcast outlet that you use. I'm hoping to get a good guest lined up for the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in 6 weeks' time. So I've got a name in mind, so hopefully that comes off. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks. I've spent the last 6 months trying to work out exactly how we have Joe Biden as the current president of the United States. So to help me to put some meat on the bones of my ignorance, I've drafted in the host of the excellent podcast titled My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, on the air for 15 years. Welcome to the Political Dark Side, Bruce Carlson. How are you doing, sir?
Very good, Matthew. Very good. Yeah, 15 years goes quick, so look out. It's going to happen to you.
Great. Look forward to that taking me by surprise. So Democrat Joe Biden, the 46th president, strikes me as an unusual choice to be leader of the free world. And I use the term loosely in the current climate. The image presented of him seems to be an intentional juxtaposition to Donald Trump, in as much as he's presented as almost a sweet old granddad in the face of Trump's aggressive style. Personally, I'm not convinced of his persona, regardless of the rights or wrongs of the Trump presidency. So I'd like to look through his history and ask you about a few incidents and their relevance to Biden today and his suitability to be in office. So to warm up, what do you consider to be the darkest element of Joe Biden's history that's of his own doing?
Wow, we got to start that way. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things, but I don't want to be I don't want to be so much of that voice of an anti-Biden voice, let's say. I'm just here to explain things so that if you have that feeling, here's what actually would support that. The general comment is I think that that juxtaposition is very important, is very real in a sense, even though as with all political figures, there's a little bit of selling going on. And you know, there's some things that aren't. The government isn't going to change completely, you know, on January 20th with any president. But I feel like, you know, there is that juxtaposition is almost the answer to the question. It was huge in the 2020 election. It's actually huge in all incumbent elections. So the darkest, I think it's better to make a general statement there that you have a person who is a senator from Delaware, and I don't know how well this is known outside the United States, but is a particular state. It is one of the smallest states, and because of that, they manipulated their laws in the state to attract corporations. In other words, shell companies or just corporations. I mean, I happen to work for one. That's almost every company in the United States is a Delaware corporation. Yeah, see, because you don't have to pay, I believe you don't pay corporate tax, so you do pay a fee, and you have to maintain an employee in Delaware, though there's people you can outsource it to. So they have this huge system that particularly helps Newcastle County, Wilmington. Well, guess who was the county commissioner before he became a senator for Newcastle County was young Joe Biden back in 72. So because of his being from Delaware and that state and all of those laws, a lot of corporate activity there, a lot of banking, a lot of credit cards in particular, even more than banks. So I think that is where you're going to mine for the richest treasure, if you're looking for these sorts of things, where he's been defending some interest like credit cards and lack of bankruptcy protection and bad on student loans in the past, even though currently as president, he has a program for that. In his past, he's been bad on those issues.
Yeah. I mean, I'd asked about I mentioned the shell companies there because I saw something about the Panama Papers, and I'm sure Delaware popped up, and I instantly thought, oh, that's funny. Joe Biden's state. How does that relate to his, relationship to special interests? And you basically answered the question there pretty much.
It would be hard before him. Alongside him was Roth, and Roth is the Roth 401k, Roth IRA, I should say, which is a financial instrument, and many other pieces of legislation. Delaware politicians are known for usually getting the finance committees or being leaders in that legislation. And, and this goes way back, by the way. Delaware's always sort of been a fairly well enough to do state, or in a colony before that. And it's small. And that means that generally speaking, it had more of a city population than it had people to take care of. So it's always had some maneuverability where corporations are attracted to it, but particularly now it's its laws. And yeah, I mean, in terms of the Panama Papers, it's kind of funny because I think from our view in the United States, there's a lot of folks who will say like, well, we don't really need those because we have Delaware and Nevada. And Delaware, at least, Delaware, well, I won't go too long with it, but Delaware basically does make you name who the head of the corporation and the treasurer and things like that. In Nevada, at least up until recently, you could just form a corporation and nobody knew who the corporation was. And only recently have courts been able to puncture that. So yeah, in America, we don't need some of those things because there are states that will actually handle that business. Yeah.
To stay on the idea of economics, Biden doesn't run in 2016, and ultimately you end up with the Donald Trump win. And for me, that's a pushback to a perceived political establishment class of lifelong politicians who've made promises to people which get broken, coupled with the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash and the destruction of employment after China joins the World Trade Organization in 2001. The crash can be directly linked back to the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which deregulated the banking industry. Biden himself has stated on numerous occasions his biggest regret was his involvement in that.
My biggest regret are a couple of votes I cast. I wish I had never voted to repeal the legislation limiting banks what they could do, Glass-Steagall.
So do you think he's economically sound?
I mean, I think that I would just go back to the earlier statement about, he's really always been a senator that has been supportive of more of financial interest than directly with consumers, always with a little bit of course, no senator is going to completely just say, I'm passing laws for the bank. So for instance, in 78, he has a role in student loans in the Middle Income Assistance Act, which provides student loans, and this was when Jimmy Carter was president, for middle class Americans. That was a big thing at the time. There were a lot of tax cuts and things all aimed at middle income. Everybody was going for that at that time. So that's great. He signs up with that. He also puts an amendment, however, to make those loans not subject to bankruptcy, meaning that from 78 on, for the first time, you're not able to claim bankruptcy if your debt is a student loan from the federal government. That is and I don't believe that fully takes effect when he puts his amendment on, but later in 1986, he's supportive. He's actually absent for the vote, but he's supportive of another legislation that actually does away with that bankruptcy. Now, I think that's also a contributor to 2008, if you ask me, because so many people had student loans and weren't able to pay them. And these are young and working people. And it's a different situation in 2008 and even in the 1990s, but there are greater debt levels in 2008, student debt, than you had in the 60s and the 70s in America, because then people were borrowing, and frankly, some people walked away from those loans, could no longer do so. You couldn't claim bankruptcy. It doesn't count towards your student loan if that loan's with the federal government. So that is something that Biden was for. So he has that duality of, well, I'm going to be for people, but I'm also, doing this favor for the banks. And a lot of the Democratic Party prior to the crash of 2008 looked at the financial companies as somewhat safe for progressive, if you ask me. And you say, well, what do you mean? And I will, well, look at the options. The Republicans in America generally, generalization, but funded by, at that time, not as much anymore, pharma companies, beer wholesalers, gun manufacturers, gun rights groups, all of these groups of people that might be villains in a lot of other areas. And for the Democrats, the financial and banking companies are like, well, we can raise money from them, and they don't care how we are on social issues. The bank Chase Bank does not care about gay rights. If anything, it's going to be for that, at least as much as you could in 2004 to 2008. But there's this whole host of issues that they took with them and only started to revisit that after the crash, and Biden's just one of those people. To get to Glass-Steagall, I guess a question I'll ask myself there is there anything nice to say about the Glass-Steagall laws at all? They're put in the 30s, if people don't know. And it basically what it says, there was so much problems during the Great Depression in the United States with banks playing with people's money, going out and investing money. By the way, this goes way back before the Depression. There's problems with insurance funds that were collected in the 19th century, these tortine funds that were kind of a little bit of a Ponzi scheme disguised as life insurance. And you get into a situation where these insurance companies have huge amounts of money. They decide not to pay some of the dividends, give themselves bigger salaries. They're big corruptors, big investors, if you will, in politicians. So this is something in our history, and it just in the 30s is when there's the first set of laws banning this, so that you at least have to separate a bank from an investment company. Now, is there anything nice to say about repeal? There was a problem, to be fair. In the 1987 Black Monday crash, I just did a podcast on it. And I got to tell you, you're going to find out as you do these podcasts, I think, you start doing different topics and you learn different things and you start to see where things intersect a little, And this is a possible point. One of the problems that happened during that Black Monday crash on that day, which came frighteningly close to the market just no longer operating, still remains the largest percentage drop on one day in the New York Stock Exchange. And London had a bad day too. One of the problems was cash liquidity. These investment companies did not have enough money, because they're merely investment companies, they're not banks, to keep that market afloat. And they had to rely on banks to fund their accounts to keep these people investing if you wanted that market to ever go back up on the next day. And only through some maneuvers by the Fed, some talking by various market leaders, even we know the chief of staff of the White House, Donald Reagan, during the Reagan administration, was calling people and saying, look, this is going to be okay. We will float you, giving banks the assurance that they could fund these investment companies. But it was scary there for a while. And investors pick up on all that stuff, and it affects the stock price. So after Black Monday, there's a lot of people talking about Glass-Steagall and saying this is a negative, because we cannot effectively fund these investment companies alone in a problem, don't have enough funds. You need to get banks involved. Now, the changes did not happen until that was a hue and cry for a while. It did not happen until the Clinton administration, when you had kind of such a belief in the stock market and the dot-com movement going on. And then Biden was, of course, one of many senators who supported that repeal. And yeah, I mean, I think it was one of many factors that caused problems later, because now you had, instead of just investment companies in trouble, you had banks in trouble as well, and they had to all be bailed out.
Yeah.
And it was a horrific crash, 2008. I mean, what more can we say about it? It was I was doing my podcast during the time, and I remember doing a Great Depression podcast just to let people know what that was like, so they would know if they were experiencing a new depression.
Just to cheer them up a bit.
Cheer them up a bit, but it was getting pretty close. It was like kind of I basically calculated that if 2008 was like the U.S. Great Depression, we would have something like 10 million people roaming the suburbs looking for work, and you didn't want that. And we didn't, because there were luckily things like Social Security are in place and government protections, unemployment, COBRA, which in the U.S. maintains our health insurance after we're let go, and the stimulus bill funded 60% of that COBRA. So you had these protections that otherwise, though, you would have a very similar situation to the 30s. The crash was just as large and frightening. So Biden deserves whatever criticism one wants to give. Now, the question is he economically sound, meaning that now he's president, right? And I think probably what you're getting to is like, if he's wrong on a lot of this stuff, like if he's president, what is he going to do? Look, I don't have the answer. The fair side of me wants to say that anybody can say, anybody's capable of change. Anybody's capable of, for instance, saying, well, I'm not the Delaware senator anymore. I don't have to listen to those banks. And also I'm getting older and I got my inner voice and that's it. And I'm going to do what I want. So, you see both sides of that. It could go one way or the other. He's not bound to all the positions he had as a senator. And no senator who runs for president is necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned like his duality of being for the people, but also being for a certain amount of special interest. I mean, you certainly saw that with, sorry, the dog's on the move.
That's okay.
You certainly saw that with the Obama administration. A lot of their appointments were Wall Street types, I believe.
Every Democrat appoints the most, because they get scared that the market's going to be afraid of them because they're scary Democrats, So they end up appointing. Clinton appoints, I guess it was Solomon. It's either Solomon or Goldman. They all go to the same place. Merrill Lynch. Reagan went to Merrill Lynch. They go to one of the Wall Street houses and pick a Treasury secretary from there.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on from economics to race relations. This one might take a while. In the South Carolina Democrat primary in 2020, Biden received 61% of the African American vote, which essentially reignites his presidential campaign. I find his race relations to be genuinely remarkable, in as much as I'm not sure how or why he's so popular, given some of the things that he's said and done, or why the media gives him a pass on it. I mean, just to reel them off, his position on busing, his friendship with Strom Thurmond, his friendship with Robert Byrd, the interview where he says, if you don't know whether to vote for me, then you ain't black.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
The interview with Cardi B, which was just cringeworthy, the bizarre corn pop story, and of course, the creation of the 1994 crime bill and the subsequent aftermath for the African American population. So how does he get away with that and be presented as champion of the black population, essentially, is what I'm looking for.
And I think it would be, I think anyone who would present him that way probably deserves criticism, because you cited a bunch of things that are fair criticisms, right? And there's a lot to explain. I think you start with the basic American elections, right? We don't have, even though I still feel like UK elections are still mostly a similar thing. They're mostly Labour or Conservative. but you at least have the other parties who can influence things. And you've seen in recent elections, and you had the 2010 where you actually had a coalition, and you have others where there's enough pull from one party or the other that might be influencing the result. We do not have that. We have two choices, essentially. The third party candidates run, they get a small amount of the vote. Occasionally people look at the numbers and say, you affected this state or that. You have two choices. You pick one or the other. Biden was up against Trump. And while Trump is enormously popular, you referenced earlier that you believe that Trump ignited a feeling of people against the establishment. I've heard very similar things. I know a lot of people that feel this way. I even feel a little of the frustration about some of the stodginess of establishment and party politics myself. And I definitely know the feeling. And I think that's exactly what happened in 2016. So you're absolutely right. And it came in two forms, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And I just think in the general election, Donald Trump, I'm not sure he got all the votes of Bernie Sanders. He got some. I know people who were Sanders-Trump, Sanders in the primary, Trump in the general. He got some people who voted with their feet by not voting at all, who were Sanders supporters, perhaps in various states. There just wasn't as much excitement about Hillary Clinton's campaign. She picks a very establishment VP candidate in Tim Kaine that wasn't exciting any of the Sanders people. So that's 2020. And so Trump wins. It's a very narrow plurality election. It has to do with winning states. It's not a majority of the country. There's millions of votes the other way. He was not enormously popular at any point during his presidency, but has a huge fan base and his social media activism. So you're presenting the image. So I always saw that as kind of like, it was a difficult thing to deal with because there was all this fire and all this excitement in some forms, and still is in social media. And you might say, oh, this guy's going to be a winner. And he very well could have won re-election, but obviously COVID, obviously the economy related to COVID. A lot of people say we might have been headed there anyway with tariff policies or anything in a poor economy, and most incumbents don't win a poor economy. Wasn't enormously popular. He is popular among Republicans, but not popular generally among the broad swath of the country, particularly in urban areas where a lot of people live. His whole hope was to win an electoral college victory. We have that here where you can win certain states. That's nice. You did it in 2016. There wasn't much. That's like trying to win a jackpot twice in a row. It probably wasn't going to happen. So you almost had a situation where anybody but Trump, as long as they were, reasonable enough, we're going to win. So it wasn't like a great, I don't think most Americans, looked at all these characteristics and made their choice. It was an emotional choice. And it was like many elections where there is an incumbent president, even the ones without somebody like a Trump who could be polarizing. Even your plain old presidents, your Clinton, your George W. Bush, your Obama, what have you. It's always about the incumbent president, their performance, and American voters assess it. Biden could have been almost anyone and would have won. That's what I think. Now, that's why he's there. Why did he get the South Carolina vote, the African-American establishment? I mean, far be it from me to say that I'm an expert in that field, but just my own observations are that for all people's thoughts about American, African-American voters in our country and how they make assessments and I would say how the majority of them make assessments and how the majority of voters make the assessments, they tend to be a very pragmatic group of voters. They aren't always as interested in the cause or the issue as much as people think. And they're very interested in strategy and winning. They have to be, because in a lot of states, including the one you mentioned, South Carolina, they're a large group, but not a majority. So it's always finding coalitions that will enable them to win if they're ever going to win in a state like South Carolina. And that's what you saw in that primary. Biden's a more established position. African-American voters have been in the Democratic Party a long time, and the poll numbers are exceedingly high for Democrats. There are about anywhere from, depending on the election, from 6 to 15% that vote for Republicans. Back when Nixon was, not so much when he's president, when he was vice president or during Eisenhower's term, there was a large Republican African-American vote. But the majority now vote Democratic. So then they're looking at who's going to win. So electability, they don't want that vote wasted. And that's what a lot of that primary is. And they even selected him over, say, Kamala Harris.
Yeah, for me, the crime bill is so important in this situation because, like you maybe said, they won't necessarily be looking at the cause, but ultimately, the crime bill does or has such a large effect on so many African American families that I find it difficult to understand how that could be looked past to then still give Joe Biden the vote.
And I don't really know if I have a total answer for that. A group of people, perhaps, that are oft disappointed. So the disappointment doesn't have the same emotional tenor it does with you or I often, because they've been disappointed so much. I mean, I think there's some element of that, particularly those who've been in politics a long time, lost a lot of battles. The fact that the crime bill has so many fathers, if you will, right? It's not just him. I mean, it's Clinton, it's Hillary Clinton to an extent that she was very involved in Bill Clinton's White House. It's a great number of, it's a group of Republicans. It's a great number of people. And I don't want to be the Biden campaign here. I certainly think that was, the obviously looking back now, it was a mistake. I also don't want to engage in too much presentism where we just think of things in the values of today. Bring it back a little bit. There's two things to consider. Crime was very high in the United States at that time. The other thing was the bill was bringing in a more democratic or more of a people's issue, at least at that time, which was 150,000 federally funded cops. Now, these days, I think we look at police in America and we have a different view. But if you go back then, you're talking about a lot of towns and cities that didn't have enough. And they couldn't. Locally funded means local taxpayers paying for it. Federally funded means generally richer people paying for it and giving your town cops. So there was this kind of more democratic or populist issue within that crime bill, in addition to the horrible things, and then all the horrible things that were said during the legislative process about predators and about criminals and things. I will just say that if you bring yourself to that time, crime and fear about crime was enormously high. The fear was probably higher than the actual crime. It almost always is. But I was around during that time. I wasn't as much walking around in cities and things like that, but it was a very different prospect. Most people didn't feel as safe working in cities and things like that at that time because of crime. I think there's one more point to make, though. To be fair, when someone is, near 80, in their 80s or near that age, you do have to question, since they're on the same stage as, say, a 40-year-old, does the 40-year-old get a pass because they never existed during that time and never had to take a position? And that's the presentism debate that I would always ask. Did Buttigieg, for instance, get a pass during those primaries? Because he never had to stand up as a senator when probably your office would have been filled with people saying, do something about crime, get me more cops. Things they probably wouldn't. Get me more cops isn't the thing you're hearing from voters these days. But certainly in 94, you were. Certainly you were. Now,
that's an interesting point.
But just Matthew saying that, I by no means want to defend the prosecutorial aspects of that or the overload on the rhetoric or the maximum sentences. Those are all huge mistakes, and anyone who did them deserves, the policy criticism they get.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier about second chances and redemption, but equally, you're saying there, like say Mayor Pete, for example, wasn't necessarily around to answer for the problems at the time. But then if Biden was around to answer for the problems at the time, surely the whole point of politics is holding your elected officials to account and then removing them for the mistakes that they have made.
Yeah, and I think he look, I mean, totally. It's both. It's both at the same time. You don't give somebody a pass for being old either. I just do think that it's useful, like especially if someone's running against younger opponents. It's like we could go back to the busing thing, for instance, because that's where Kamala Harris comes in, where she actually made an issue of that. And it's there again, he was a senator who actually had to face the issue when constituents, a majority of constituents in his state, would have pushed him that way. She was a senator when that would have been politically impossible. Well, only the most racist voters would have even brought an issue of busing up in California when Kamala Harris was a senator. Incidentally, it is interesting, though. She did end up with the same position as Biden, which is, in other words, and they pointed that out. In other words, if a community didn't want it, they shouldn't be forced. Well, that's the exact thing that was the whole issue in the 70s. But Biden was both as a Newcastle County, Delaware commissioner and as a senator directly in that debate. They wanted to bus Wilmington and they wanted to bus them into the outer county, more suburban areas. He was against it. He also went to town meetings where people were yelling at him to be against it. It was totally the overwhelming opinion of most of his constituency. There were even some in the city of Wilmington, even some who were African-American, were like, I don't want my kids going to school where if I get called from work, I can't go see them or get them. I don't have a car and things like that. This is what he brings up in his defense, at least. So Biden, though, is a busing opponent in the Senate. There's no other way to look at it. He will, the best you can say on that issue is that he saved. There was a bill where they were going to eliminate, there were some Southern senators who are going to eliminate even the ability of the courts to do any kind of, to order busing if the county refused to do it. And Biden actually saved that. However, he allowed a bill to go forward and supported a bill in the same process that eliminated the ability of the federal government to, the United States government, to the Justice Department, say, to order that a county institute busing to correct a wrong. It could only be the courts under Biden. So he's gonna say I saved busing, and at the same time he's against it. So that's another important issue. But again, like I did notice, especially as a historian, I have a little bit of, I'm hearing Kamala Harris attack him on it, and I'm thinking, well, you're just benefiting from youthfulness, I guess, and maybe it's right for voters to think about both things. Yeah, you didn't make the right choice then. You should have. Okay, so I guess the way to say what you're saying, Matthew, is I would rather have someone before me who's 80 years old who made the right choice back then. Absolutely fair to say. Absolutely fair to say. If it's available. If it's available,
It should be available.
Yeah.
Really. But to move on to foreign policy, he was in favor of the Iraq war, and as part of the Obama administration, he's involved in the continuation of Middle East intervention. There's some strangeness with the backing of the far-right Ukrainian government, and there's a frostiness with Vladimir Putin, obviously. Is he a capable statesman on the international stage?
I mean, I think it's a tough hand that America has right now for any president, and he's capable enough. I don't see any overwhelming success so far, though. There's nothing I can point to and say this is great, other than, you're not Trump. And I think there were some concerns with Trump about being on the other, too far on the other end of the pendulum, perhaps too friendly with Vladimir Putin, as we sort of seem to be entering this second, or maybe some might say third, Cold War, because some people count the 40s and 50s and then the early 80s as two different Cold Wars. And we could be entering a second or a third right now where the battle is over cyber attacks and microwaves versus, and a few satellite states, say, versus, troops or nuclear weapons, which we're actually hopefully both working to try to reduce. But the other things are going on, and I haven't seen any great success there. Is he capable? So we'll go back to the same question you asked on the economics. So if you look at the past, then what reason do we have to be confident when the choices were made that were wrong in the past? I think it's an acknowledged wrong right now about the Iraq War. And there's two Gulf Wars, really. You have to go back, and since Biden's a senator such a long time, I'm finding this in my podcast, he's showing up. He's like a Forrest Gump. He's showing up in every aspect of history. I'm talking about Carter's 76 convention, and there's Biden in the background. He picked the convention city. He is a senator as early as 72. I mean, he's been in politics. It doesn't get any longer than this. Just to dive in on the point you made about
with the benefit of hindsight, now we can look back on the Iraq War. He was there as vice president from 08 to 16 with the benefit of hindsight, knowing it was wrong then, and America still maintains its position in Iraq for that time. So he had his 8 years to make his decision about it.
Yeah, no, I get you. I get you. And there is an evolution. He starts came out initially against the first Gulf War, where Iraq had invaded Kuwait and we were going to use military force. First President Bush. However, after being against it and losing the vote, he makes every possible positive statement about the war and attacks other Democrats who were attacking George H.W. Bush. Then, as you know, in 2001, I actually want to stay there because I think there's enough. You don't even need the hindsight. I think there was enough at the time to know in 2003 that this evidence was shoddy, and that if you just asked a few questions that almost any senator should have been capable of, that you would know not to go to war. And it was more about attacks on patriotism and someone like a Biden want to retain their Senate seat, maybe have a chance at the presidency, 2004, 2008, and that voting for the war was more politically convenient. And then I think you're right, with maybe a small caveat that a vice president has whatever influence a vice president has. So that kind of a call is really on President Obama with just a recommendation at the table from Joe Biden. However, to your point, I doubt that recommendation was any more pro-withdrawal than Obama's position would have been. It's possible. We'll find out it was, but I don't think so.
Well, his position was withdrawal, wasn't it? Obama ran on a campaign of bringing the troops home, didn't he, in 08, and then not immediately, but there was an about turn or we'll do it in 6 months, and then the can gets kicked down the road continuously until now.
I mean, yeah, that's basically what happened. And then once, I think the original sin, we should make it clear, original sin is in 03 and 04. And if George W. Bush isn't pushing it, even I would even go as far as to defend Biden and Clinton and Kerry and the other senators that voted for it a bit. It's always the president of the United States, here at least, that we give some foreign policy credence to. They always have a bit more information. I can repeat what I said, that I believe any reasonable person should have been able to ask the right questions. And Bernie Sanders did it in the case of the Iraq War, and say that this is crazy. Paul Wellstone, Bernie Sanders, other people. This is crazy. You don't have enough evidence to do this. We can do a containment. We can try sending inspectors in. We can do a lot of, Saddam Hussein's not a nice guy, all of these things. But, and there's two tragedies about it. One is that we went into war, or perhaps we didn't. And the other is that we pulled troops out of the Afghanistan effort. So there's two things going on there at once. The original sin goes to Bush, though, who had the information, manipulated the information as near as we can tell, really got away with it for 2 terms. Colin Powell has regretted his statements. It's very clear that his statements were different from memos that he was presented with. So to be fair, there wasn't always clear information given to the Senate or to the UN by the people whose job it was to do that. We see now in their own memos. So you get to 2008, and now you're president and troops are on the ground. It's a very different thing. And really Obama's position was removed from Iraq because the right war is Afghanistan. So he was still running as a pro-war campaign, and Democrats really haven't been able to get away from pro-war that much as the general party candidates here. Even Kerry running in 2004 was still pro-Iraq war. He's just going to win it quicker or fight it differently. And in 2008, Obama was, well, I'm pro-war. I'm just, the right war is Afghanistan. So it's politically acceptable at that time. Well, that was after the war was extremely unpopular and deaths were being announced every night. And then you saw what happened. You really have little maneuverability because the minute you're pulling things out, you get something like the Islamic State that comes in and fills the void. But there wouldn't have been a void if we hadn't started it in the first place. So it is a bit of a different policy choice to continue than to start it in the first place. Now you see that he's starting to wrap up the Afghanistan war. And again, it's that same thing where I even see some liberals and Democrats now asking, well, I mean, we're all for stopping war here, but boy, now we think it's just going to lead to something bigger once you pull out and Taliban takes over Afghanistan. And so you almost end up after the first death or after the first blood, it's really hard to be that pacifist later. I mean, someone has to do it. Someone has to cut. But
it's a Pandora's box, really. You don't want to open it and see what happens, essentially.
And if the real question of is, how did Biden win, or why was there another Democrat available? I mean, you look at those other choices. I don't think they would be doing much better. Buttigieg, Harris, even Warren, I think, foreign policy wise would be similar. You probably have a different with Sanders. I don't know whether it would be better or not. I just know that it would be different. Why didn't Sanders win? Two things happened. One was COVID that basically shut down the primary. That's the other thing. You referenced that South Carolina primary. And by the way, I apologize if I'm rambling a bit.
It's perfect.
I told you we wouldn't have enough time, and then I knew I should have known that this is the way I do things. But anyway, you talked about that South Carolina primary, and that was the signature event, but that was only the origin of Biden even having a chance. The way I see the whole thing is Biden really did pay a price for all of the mistakes, for all of, by the way, what throughout his career, a lot of like goofy statements and weird stuff, the war vote, everything else. I believe he did pay a price because before South Carolina, he was losing. And for any Democrat before Joe Biden, that's the death knell. You're done. Some other candidate takes it away. The trouble was there was a split among both the more, say, moderate or establishment Democrats and the progressive or liberal left Democrats, Warren Sanders and Buttigieg, Harris, Klobuchar, Biden, splitting votes. So no one was really winning outright in a convincing way, saving it for South Carolina, the first big win in a state. And because of the comeback, there's some momentum there. But also, you still would have had Biden versus Sanders. But in effect, I did notice that COVID kind of shut the game down for a while.
There's certainly like a machine, though, that gets behind us, like a certain candidate and can deny other candidates that it's choosing. I mean, you saw it in 2016 with Clinton and Sanders. Why not somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, especially in terms of foreign policy, having served in Iraq?
I do understand she served in Iraq. I think American voters, that's a positive for American voters, but most American voters kind of know that play. It doesn't. Kerry tried that in 2004. It got him as far as it's going. Just because you're a veteran.
John McCain as well, I suppose.
Yeah, just because you're a veteran, it means a lot in America. It's definitely one of our treasured values, especially across the 50 states. If you're not like in the the east side of Manhattan or something. But everywhere else, I mean, it's a treasured value to be a veteran, but it doesn't necessarily extend that everyone's going to agree with your foreign policy.
Her position was more, I've been there, I've experienced it. This is a bad thing. We shouldn't be doing this. Whereas previous ex-military candidates, I don't recall them denouncing military intervention as much. It was more like, I served, something awful happened to me, vote for me, as opposed to I served, we shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, well, we're also getting very late in the war too, though. We're in our 20th. This will be our. This is a crazy one. This is the 21st or the 20th year. Next year will be the 21st year of the war if we don't officially end it. No one expected it to go on so long. I can only imagine if the Vietnam War went from 68 to 88, where we fought. If we fought the 88 election, where Biden is also a player.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
But real quick, I think it's absolutely what you're saying is right. I think like that's probably your greatest asset, a veteran who can make that case. But I do think, again, I go back to a little bit of just looking at history and things, and a little bit late too. Now the war has gone on for, I guess by 2016 we can say it was 15 years. So a little easier to be against it then and say pull out than when we really needed somebody young, say in 2003, who would have run in the Democratic Party and been a veteran and been able to make that case. A lot of people were open. That's the thing. Kerry, for instance, was an anti-Vietnam War activist as a young person. And so I know that there were a lot of disappointed Democrats who was hoping that he would do something similar at that time and say, I am a veteran, and make his convention speech in Boston. I'm against this. I will put an end to this. Maybe it was something like, I'll do it responsibly. I'll get troops out safely, whatever. But it wasn't. It was definitely a statement of, we're going to win. I'm just going to win faster. Well, win faster means more blood or more putting more people in. So no, we haven't gotten in there. I can't tell you why a specific candidate like Tulsi, didn't get it in 2020. I tend to think most Democratic voters, it's not all like kind of corporate and manipulation and things. I think there are a lot of Democrats in the United States who are more of a moderate to conservative persuasion. They're not all liberals just because they're Democrats. There's a very like union type Democrat, older type Democrat in the United States that, and then we're not even talking about the South, where you have Democrats who go back and they're still listed as D, and they might vote for Trump or vote for a conservative in a primary. So you got a lot of that going on. 50 states. It's a very very hard country to be very liberal in. She's from Hawaii. She got her congressional seat from a very liberal district. So that's hard to run nationally. Most of the attention given to her is given to her by Republicans now, and mostly when she attacks other Democrats, like on the Fox network. It's not for her social programs or being against the war. It's more for they might interview her on Fox News about Syria or positions there. But I really think what happened, to wrap it up on the 2020, to answer the first question, is that why we even have them, is there was a consolidation that occurred. So that is, you talk about machines and establishments and things. Boy, I tell you, if you want to believe that there's a cigar-filled room where nowadays it would be vaping, where somebody picks candidates, well, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Harris give up on the same day, leaving it to Sanders, Biden, and Warren still in it, but most people thinking it's Biden, Sanders.
She was there as a spoiler at that point to the Sanders.
She was a spoiler, although, I can attest to, it certainly wasn't AstroTurf. There are real Warren supporters here. I mean, you just ask them, they'll light up Twitter or light up an actual room. They were there. It was split on that. I don't know how that would have worked. I really think COVID killed the game after that. It canceled the primary in a sense, and also the whole primary was this conviction that Trump had to be beaten. And so electability became a factor. Those three candidates that gave up, I think each one looked at it, Buttigieg, Harris, Klobuchar, and said, it's not going to happen for us. We don't have a way to run this table. So, and I'm sure somebody went to somebody and said, you want a chance of being VP? Both to Klobuchar and Harris. To even have a chance, you have to do it now. Senators waiting for your call. For Buttigieg, you want a secretary position, or do you want to be a losing candidate for the presidency?
Yeah.
And you know, not a lot of people make it back from that. So what do you want? You know, Biden did, but most people don't. That's what I think happened. There's some kind of deals and also fear of Trump. Trump was the other for most in the Democratic Party. That's real. That's not a manufactured thing. Democratic voters felt that way too. Like, stop fighting so much. We got to beat this guy. That wasn't the case in 2016, where there was a lot more vigorous primary, I believe.
Yeah. I mean, you said the electability is what it boiled down to. And I suppose the whole point of this conversation is me trying to understand, based on Biden's history, how he had any electability at all. Yeah. So another element I kind of wanted to look at was his relationship with the truth. He has numerous sexual assault allegations from 8 different women, including most prominently Tara Reid. There's an episode of David Letterman where he claimed to have been arrested for trespassing in the Senate at the age of 21, which turns out to be no record of that. His 1988 presidential campaign, as you mentioned, that goes up in flames after various false claims about his education and a plagiarized speech from the UK Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock.
Democratic presidential candidate Joseph Biden today faces a controversy. 3 weeks ago at a debate at the Iowa State Fair, he used phrases identical to those delivered by British Labour Party leader Neil Kinnock.
Biden seemed to be claiming Kinnock's vision and life as his own.
Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college?
Why is Gladys the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
My ancestors who worked in the coal mines in northeast Pennsylvania don't come up after 12 hours and play football.
8 hours underground and then come up and play football.
It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
There was no platform upon which they could stand.
So I suppose I'm asking, are these suitable character traits for a president?
Well, it worked to be a vice president in 08 and in 12 is the easiest answer. And then if you're looking at electability as someone who, if you generally want Democrats to win, or more to the point, you wanted Trump to lose, you probably, despite everything we've talked about today, student loans, these allegations, statements he's made, silly things he's done over the years, statements that I think made, according to some books that I've read, made Obama's eyebrows roll, like, Joe, don't do that anymore. Like, you know, things like that. Why do you pick him? And it's a vice president is a stronger candidate, but then that doesn't answer why Obama would have picked him, right? Biden's from Delaware. Delaware only has 3 electoral votes. It's pretty meaningless. However, as goes Delaware, very often goes the Philadelphia media market. The Philadelphia media market's connected to winning the state of Pennsylvania. State of Pennsylvania was a must-win for Trump in 2016. Nobody thought he'd win it. He did win it. He's very popular in the western side of Pennsylvania, but it's not the populated area. Incidentally, he did fairly well in the eastern part. I looked, there's a county called Bucks, which normally goes, it switches over the years, but it won. Hillary Clinton won in 2016, but just barely. And usually there'd be more of a margin for Democrats there. Biden won it in 2020. Winning Pennsylvania is a key. It's not only that, for the faults, and I can't speak to the allegations. You'll never hear me say, don't listen to a person who makes an allegation that's not, it just didn't seem to carry. It didn't, it was out there. I think it was available for voters to look at. I think eventually it just didn't make a difference for most people, is the best I can say. But in terms of that electability, that goes to two things. One is just, as someone who watches the politics, that state of Pennsylvania is critical. And it was also critical in 2008, critical in 2004. It's been 2000. Pennsylvania is a critical swing state, especially one that's reachable by Democrats, where others aren't as reachable. Like Ohio has gone for Republicans now, and there's no coming back. Biden also has a kind of working class credibility and in the image of him, and that, he's Joe. He takes the train home every day. There's the way that he talks, where he's from. It works for places like Wisconsin. It works for places like Minnesota. It works for American politics where there is a little bit of a thing going on. People are moving out to more exurb areas, and they're working class, but they've made some money, and Democrats still have a chance at them, but they're losing them fast. And Trump got a lot of them in 2016. Biden got some of those people back. And so for all his faults, if electability, if you just want to win, I think it was the right choice. I think Buttigieg would have been destroyed. The first debate, I'm sorry to say, I mean, he seemed like a very nice person and has had many assets. But in a national campaign, in the first debate, would have been destroyed. Biden, well, the negative side is he made so many goofball statements over the years, these goofy statements and things, that one wasn't going to destroy him in 2020. Should I say immunization? Maybe there's a little bit of that with older politicians. Where a Buttigieg, the first time it happened, if he was the candidate, would have been, this guy's terrible. Look at that. He made a mistake. He made a flub.
You saw that a bit with, was it O'Rourke? Made a few strange statements, and that disqualified him fairly rapidly.
New people coming in. It's unfortunate we don't like use that. I'll be like, oh, Joe versus this guy's, and you also get afraid if you're in the same party and this is your candidate, you start losing confidence and the polls go down, and then the media runs with that, and that's how general campaigns work. For all his faults, Joe Biden, a professional politician, you weren't going to see some of these obvious things. And in a debate with Trump, he was able to at least maintain a little bit of I still think Trump talked a lot more. Biden's a very, especially with his age, he wasn't able to always go toe for toe, but he's able to at least maintain a little bit of a fight back. Some other Democrats might be more, try to be above the fray. And that doesn't work when you're up against Trump. So for those reasons, I think people felt Biden might have been a good choice. There could have been others that didn't run, but they didn't run. And Sanders might have had it. I think almost any Democrat. So if Sanders was able to win the primary, I think he might have had a shot at winning the 2020 election, especially with COVID, tariffs, the economy, Trump's unpopularity, and some of the statements. Because any statements Joe Biden made compared to what Trump had said over 4 years, I think were just looked at. I will address 88 just because you brought it up. So Biden tries to run the first time in 1988, tries to be a new candidate. Now, that's an important thing to understand with Biden. We were talking about Delaware before. When Biden became a senator, it was a surprise win by a very young person. He was barely old enough to get the Senate seat, beating a Republican in a state that Nixon won. Delaware was a Republican state at that time. It's no longer so, but it was. Democrats didn't have a chance there. Biden was written off. Because he was written off, he won in an upset. It's such a small state. You can knock on every door. And he had tremendous energy and did this. The other guy was a little lethargic, and Biden beat him just by a few thousand votes. He gets in there. He's not super liberal Democrat. He's being very cautious almost his whole career. When he runs in 88, it's to run to be more of a yuppie Democrat, a new type of Democrat, to reach out to the yuppies, the people that might have voted for Reagan in 1980 and 1984, that had some money, that were younger. It was like the Democrats have to move away from McGovern and move away from the hippies, say, and the real, and then also the labor and liberal activists. And that was really where Biden came from and what he was trying to do in 88. He was trying to be new Koch, like a new type of Democrat.
A bit like Tony Blair.
Very much
move the Labour Party more centrist.
Very much so.
Or more
But
to
he
the right,
ended up copying Tony Blair's boss, Neil Kinnock, right? Yeah. So he ended up copying a speech that Neil Kinnock gave, and it's such. First of all, the '87 UK campaign is incredible. Nobody expects, and Thatcher just won, I believe, in the '83 election, won this outstanding victory. The Labour Party's in shambles. Nobody thinks they have a chance. And it's, I think, one of the first times in British politics where a single individual runs the way they do in America and starts to influence the campaign. And Neil Kinnock is running better than the Labour Party, and he's making these speeches. And one of them is, it's a great question that he asked that all progressives and liberals should ask in every country. Why did my ancestors do better than, or why did I do better, and why does my wife do better than my ancestors? Were they stupid? Is the brain different? That I'm paraphrasing because I certainly don't want to copy the speech. Yeah. And then, he goes, and one of the lines is, my ancestors worked in the mines and then went up and played football all day, all night. They were strong people. You're telling me they were lazy? They weren't. Why didn't they succeed? And of course, it's because of a series of government policies that we need to support and enact about university education and social spending and things like that. Great. Biden picks up on it. Picking up on the idea is great. He actually copies the speech word for word, and he makes the speech, including the bit about minors. So then, and he makes it at the Iowa Fair. And in a previous speech, he gives credit to Neil Kinnock in the Iowa Fair speech with the cameras on and everything. He does not. It's a few days later. They start looking it up, and they're like, he doesn't have any minors in his ancestry, and it doesn't. Yeah. There were no Biden minors, but he actually, instead of just saying like, why did the Bidens do better? Why am I doing better than the Bidens in Scranton? He said, my ancestors were minors and they played football. He used American football now, but yeah. And that it's not only that, usually it's like a rule of threes. You catch three things, they catch something else, and then they catch in Syracuse Law School. He had cribbed law notes. Reality is he didn't rewrite somebody's paper. He copied the notes. It's still a no-no in law school. It's not as big as if you actually copied somebody's actual legal paper, but he copied the notes. And he was brought into the dean, and he had to make up the course. And the reporters found those records from his Syracuse law school days. And because of all of those things, Biden, had to, even before the 88 election, it's actually 87, he had to terminate his campaign. And so that is the first time he runs. He runs again in 2008 and then runs in 2020. And most people don't get that many chances. No, it is unusual. The Biden thing is unusual. He absent Trump, he probably wouldn't be president.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned his electability a lot, and obviously his age. To kind of mention something that's quite bizarre. There's an interesting Stephen Colbert interview with Barack Obama, where he says,
"You know what? If I could make an arrangement where I had a stand-in, a front man or front woman, and they had an earpiece in, and I was just in my basement in my sweats, looking through the stuff, and then I could sort of deliver the lines, but somebody else was doing all the talking and ceremony. Wow. I'd be fine with that because I found the work fascinating."
I'll give Biden the benefit of the doubt because he's got a stutter, but the overall point made there is curious. I mean, do you think Biden could be a proxy for someone or an organization, and for lack of a better phrase, the deep state or special interests, like you mentioned earlier? I mean, do you think he is actually at the wheel or even commands the same sort of power of presidents before him?
Everyone should remain should maintain a healthy skepticism about everything, in my opinion. There's no, I never want to say never to anything. And it's great to think about those scenarios because you never know, even if there's some silly, I don't consider the deep state like it could be a silly term, but it could have some meaning in that there are some people who keep the same jobs over a lot of time, right? And you certainly saw the Bush administration was benefiting from the people that got us in the Iraq War were people who were in the Ford administration in the 1970s. Is that a deep? You don't need too much of a scary term to say that's somewhat of a deep state thing, because those same people kept getting the jobs, kept getting favors. Okay, so there could be some light version of it. That all being said, I don't think it's as like robotic as what you. I don't think that scenario you're describing. People function differently at old age than others. That being said, his age, it should be a concern. It's another thing where I say if Trump wasn't the other choice, I don't think you get somebody this old elected president. I will say, on the other hand, there were a lot of people that wanted Sanders, and I don't think age was ever a factor for many of those young people who were supporting him. There's a positive to age. The positive to age is that sometimes young people are on the rise, and they want some things, and they're going to have a lot of years they need income for. With older people, sometimes we can say, well, he's only got a couple of years left. It's hopefully going to be about duty and things like that. You have to keep watching a president like this for capability, for speech, for all of those things. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking those questions for somebody who is a leader. Seems my view, and I do have a little bit of advantage of watching a lot of old video of the old Biden, and the mannerisms are similar but slower. I don't see like it lost. I see him kind of affecting the same thing as that 88 Biden, but which was always there was always a little awkwardness to it. Like it was never quite super polished. Always a little bit overstated, a little bit overstated when he was judiciary chair, making those statements. There's always a little bit of, hey, he rehearsed this a lot in Biden. And so I look out for all those things, and I don't know what'll happen, with that. You could reach a point where he can't serve anymore, or you could reach a point where he's running in 2024. I had a mayor in a town that I lived in that was 81. He was still taking neighbors' complaints and meetings till midnight and everything that a mayor should do at that time. The guy go back to Reagan, for instance, was our oldest president prior to this. But he obviously, we know now, had a condition. So he had dementia, and now we know that the onset of that is earlier. If Biden does not have that, then he could be functioning well at this age, versus a Reagan who was actually younger, but not functioning well in that second term. There are things like diary entries declined between Reagan's first term. Reagan kept a diary every day, first term and second term. You decline in the diary. We see that, So we'll, keep watching. And these are totally fair questions to ask to me. The age, it's not unfair to just, not to consider age in the presidency, and for people in other countries, because our leader is so important to yours. Maybe not as much as 25 years ago, but still.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to lead you down the path there of too much conspiratorial stuff, because the nature of your work and your podcast is so well researched and everything. I didn't want to draw you out on too much speculation. I just thought it was a very interesting statement from Obama, especially given when you also have the questions about Biden's cognitive ability.
Presidents and vice presidents don't assume they're a team throughout history. There's a lot of, they say they're a team. There's always a lot of tension there. Eisenhower and Nixon, Humphrey and Johnson, Bush, Reagan barely consulted Bush. He was in the NSC meetings, I guess, but until Bush became president in his own right, he didn't have a lot of power. They're not always as equal. There's a lot of politics behind those choices, and for instance, even Biden Harris, I don't know the relationship, time will tell. The choices are always made for politics and a little bit for government. Okay. Yeah. You want somebody that can govern maybe, but politics is the bigger choice. And in terms of the conspiracy stuff, I think the best way to blend what I do and all of that is that I think it's healthy to have that skepticism and ask questions and things, but you got to watch the conclusions you come to, and just assume there's this term out there I see on Twitter, so I'm just going to glom onto it. But the nature, Americans are very skeptical people by nature. We're very, still think there's that pioneer attitude in a lot of maybe not in the Northeast, but in other parts of the country. There's a lot of like, show me, don't tell me. That's how W. Bush got elected. They like that kind of thing. All those factors are present. People do not make choices in America. Probably more than any country, make what I would call heuristic choices based on emotions and gut feelings. Could happen everywhere, but I think there's probably more policy consideration in other places than America.
Yeah, I mean, I listened to you on a show explaining how you felt like everything had already happened before in politics. And given that we've got COVID, the restriction on rights, the censorship of the internet, the inflation, the talk of election fraud, the strange relationship between states and global institutions, and the image that Biden's currently given off, do you feel like we are navigating unprecedented times?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that almost everything has happened before, because even some of the things you mentioned, we had a pandemic in 1918. It just depends how long the view of history is. We had inflation in the 70s. It's only this generation that's going to be knocked out. If they don't live in like Brazil or something, they're going to be knocked off their duffer by inflation because they have no experience with it whatsoever. In America, we have no experience. We've had low inflation since the 90s. We have no idea what it is. We've had low interest rates since the 90s. If those go up, we have no idea. Americans will be caught off guard. They have to go to the history textbooks where some of this has happened before. Figure like Trump, I mean, and even the current administration and things they're doing, the mass, this pandemic and the mass response to it, and the protests and the conflict and social media, all of it is very new. There's new forms happening, certainly. Just because, what's the best way? Mark Twain says, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. It rhymes. It doesn't, it's not exactly the same. And new technologies, if there is going to be changes, that's what really changes things. I'm sure the first cannon that was brought to battle, changed the world a little bit in the way that some herald couldn't describe, who only knew of archers and swords and things like that. But so technology is and social media is the technology of our time that can put people in one place at one time or bring people together that aren't normally able to find each other. That's different. And if you bring that into politics, that's very different. The real question to ask, though, is, does that mean you throw away the history book? And I say no. It's still of use. It's just not everything anymore. Yeah, still got to assess your current situation. The whole time I've done the podcast, I've always said there could be new events. It's just that you use history to better understand what possibly to do or what possibly might happen. Can't predict. I don't really do a lot of prediction or how you should feel about it.
Yeah.
And all of those things. It should, hopefully, reading history should make one feel a little better, maybe a little calmer.
Well, I certainly feel that way when I listen to your podcast. I'll say that much. I mean, do you want to tell the listeners where they can find you a bit more?
Oh yeah, sure.
Website?
Yeah, it's just My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. It's on iTunes, Apple Podcasts. Got a lot of people on Podcast Addict now and Overcast listening, and Stitcher and anywhere else that you get podcasts. The UK is my third largest country after Canada and has more listeners than many states in the US for the podcast. So I'm very proud to have listeners. I'm just excited that they're interested in hearing me talk 98% of the time about the US, because that's what I know. That's what we talk about, politics and the history.
Yeah, I mean, I personally find US politics, it's interesting, but I find it easier to follow because not to disregard too much of history, but it's relatively new. There's a lot been going on in the last 200 years, whereas British history, it's quite difficult to follow because it goes on forever and everyone's got the same name.
That's great. Yeah, you did have John Smith almost became the prime minister at one point. That would have been.
Yeah, I mean, like the king. You know, you want the 8th Henry. How are you meant to follow that? You know. Anyway, thanks a lot for your time today.
Absolutely, glad to do it. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Matthew.
Join us next time for the Political Dark Side Podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It was just ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.